Ancient Hermetic initiates believed that every human being is unconsciously commanding reality through thought, emotion, and attention every single day. The terrifying part was not the power itself, but the fact that most people never realize what they are repeatedly creating until it becomes their life. In this audiobook, you will uncover the forbidden metaphysical laws hidden inside Hermeticism, Stoicism, and mystical psychology, once reserved for only priests, initiates, and secret schools of wisdom. You will discover why imagination behaves like force, why repeated emotion becomes destiny, why silence sharpens power, and why the ancients believed reality responds not to desire alone, but to disciplined consciousness. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Law of Mental Reality. According to teachings echoed inside the Kybalion, the first and greatest law of metaphysics was astonishingly simple. The universe is mental, not imaginary, not unreal. Mental in the sense that consciousness participates in shaping experience itself. This idea appeared centuries earlier in the hidden teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage said to unite Egyptian and Greek wisdom traditions. In the mystery schools near the temples of ancient Egypt, students were taught that thought was not passive, thought was formative. Repeated emotion, repeated attention, repeated expectation, these slowly organized perception, behavior, and eventually destiny itself. The ancients observed something modern psychology would later rediscover in different language. Human beings do not merely react to reality. They interpret it continuously, and interpretation becomes experience over time. A fearful mind notices danger everywhere, an ambitious mind notices opportunity, a bitter mind notices betrayal. The outer world appears different because the inner lens is different. This was the hidden core of Hermetic mentalism. There is an old story, preserved in fragments of esoteric tradition, about a young initiate who entered an Egyptian mystery school seeking power over external circumstances. He wanted influence, prosperity, and protection from suffering. Like many who came before him, he believed secret wisdom would give him control over the outer world. The elder guiding the school listened quietly, then brought the initiate to a still pool of water beneath the temple chambers. The elder asked him to stare into the reflection. "What do you see?" he asked. "Myself," the initiate answered. The elder disturbed the water with his hand. The reflection shattered into fragments. "And now?" "Nothing clearly," the elder nodded. "Then understand this. Reality reflects the condition of the mind observing it." The lesson was simple but devastating. A disturbed mind creates distorted perception. A disciplined mind sees clearly, and clarity changes action, timing, emotion, and ultimately outcome. This is why ancient initiates guarded thought so carefully. They believed repetitive thinking was not harmless background noise. It was invisible architecture. Every repeated internal statement slowly became instruction to the subconscious mind. Over months and years, these instructions hardened into personality, expectation, and behavior. Eventually, people called the result life. Modern people often underestimate the force of repetition. Yet consider how many individuals silently rehearse limitation every day. "Nothing ever works for me. I always struggle. People like me never succeed." At first, these seem like emotional reactions, but repeated often enough, they become internal law. The mind begins organizing perception around them. Opportunities are ignored. Confidence weakens. Decisions become defensive. Slowly, reality begins mirroring the structure of thought, not magically, psychologically, energetically, behaviorally. The Hermetic teachers understood that consciousness operates like a tuning mechanism. What dominates internally influences what becomes visible externally. That is why two people can live in the same city, work similar jobs, and face similar circumstances, yet experience completely different realities. One lives in possibility, the other lives in defeat. Their worlds diverge long before visible outcomes appear. A Roman philosopher, centuries later, would echo the same truth in a different form. Meditations repeatedly emphasizes that the human mind becomes colored by its dominant thoughts. Modern neuroscience now confirms that repeated mental focus strengthens neural pathways. Ancient Hermeticism understood the principle intuitively long before scientific language existed. The mind obeys repetition, and repetition becomes identity. This is why the ancient schools insisted that mastery begins internally, not externally. Wealth, influence, confidence, resilience, these were seen as secondary expressions of deeper mental structures already formed within consciousness. A chaotic inner world eventually creates chaotic decisions. A disciplined inner world eventually creates coherent action. The initiate in ancient traditions was therefore taught to observe thought before attempting to control circumstance, because circumstance was often the delayed echo of inner patterns already established. This is the part many people resist. It is easier to blame the visible world than confront invisible habits of mind. Easier to fight circumstances than question the emotional narratives repeated daily beneath awareness. But the Hermetic masters believed this confrontation was the beginning of freedom, not perfection, awareness. They taught that once a person becomes conscious of repetitive internal patterns, those patterns begin losing unconscious power. Observation interrupts automation. Awareness weakens old mental momentum. Over time, new patterns become possible. That is why the practical action hidden inside this ancient law is deceptively simple. Monitor repetitive thoughts daily, not occasionally daily. Observe the phrases repeated most often in moments of stress, frustration, fear, and uncertainty. Those thoughts are not random. They are instructions being carved into the deeper layers of consciousness. And according to Hermetic teaching, consciousness eventually expresses what it repeatedly accepts. The ancients understood something modern life often forgets. The mind is not merely witnessing reality. It is participating in it. Chapter 2, Hermes Trismegistus and the Secret Architecture of Existence. Long before modern civilization began measuring the visible world through science and technology, there were whispers of another kind of knowledge. Knowledge concerned not with matter itself, but with the hidden principles operating beneath it. At the center of these whispers stood a mysterious figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Some believed he was a real sage. Others claimed he was symbolic, a fusion of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. But across centuries, one belief remained consistent. Hermes was said to possess forbidden understanding about the architecture of existence itself. Texts later gathered into the Corpus Hermeticum described reality not as dead matter drifting through chaos, but as layered consciousness connected through hidden law. According to these teachings, visible reality emerged from deeper invisible principles: mind, vibration, correspondence, rhythm, and cause. The universe was not random. It was structured, alive with intelligence. This idea transformed the way initiates viewed existence. They no longer saw human beings as isolated creatures, struggling through meaningless events. Instead, they saw humanity as participating within a vast living system where thoughts, emotions, symbols, and actions carried energetic consequence. A famous Hermetic phrase captures this perfectly: "As above, so below." The statement later appeared inside the emerald tablet, but its meaning extended far beyond mystical poetry. It implied correspondence between inner and outer worlds, patterns repeated across levels of existence. The structure of the individual mind reflected larger universal principles. Ancient initiates therefore studied themselves as carefully as they studied the stars, because both revealed law. There is a fascinating story told among esoteric traditions about a traveler who journeyed across deserts seeking hidden wisdom from hermetic priests. After months of hardship, he finally reached a temple and asked the elder within, "What force governs human destiny?" The elder pointed toward a massive stone pillar supporting the temple ceiling. "Do you see that pillar?" he asked. "Yes. It appears still," the elder said. "Yet thousands of invisible pressures hold it in place, remove the hidden forces, and the visible structure collapses." The traveler remained silent. The elder continued, "Human life is the same. Visible reality rests upon invisible structures. This was the secret architecture Hermes supposedly taught. Visible outcomes often emerge from invisible internal patterns long before they materialize externally. Fear influences perception. Perception influences action. Action influences results. Eventually, people mistake the visible result as the beginning of the process, when in truth it was only the final stage. Modern psychology approaches similar ideas through conditioning, subconscious programming, and cognitive bias. But Hermetic philosophy framed the process spiritually and metaphysically. Consciousness was not merely reacting to the universe, it was participating in its unfolding through alignment with hidden law. This is why ancient initiates valued perception so deeply. Perception was not passive, it was creative orientation. A person focused constantly on hostility would unconsciously organize life around defense. A person focused on possibility would unconsciously recognize openings others ignored. Over time, their realities diverged, not because the universe arbitrarily favored one person over another, but because consciousness shaped interaction with existence itself. The Hermetic teachings therefore warned against careless mental habits, not because thoughts instantly altered the cosmos like fantasy, but because repeated internal states slowly influenced behavior, emotional energy, and interpretation until reality itself appeared to reorganize around them. And perhaps most importantly, Hermes taught that hidden laws operate whether people recognize them or not. Gravity affects both the informed and the ignorant. So do mental patterns, so do emotional states, so does attention. This is why ancient wisdom traditions emphasized self-observation before external conquest. They believed the greatest ignorance was not lack of information, but unconscious participation in destructive internal patterns. The practical lesson hidden inside these teachings remains profoundly relevant today. Treat perception as creative force. Observe how interpretation shapes emotion. Observe how emotion shapes action. Observe how action shapes consequence. Because the architecture of existence may not begin in the visible world at all. It may begin in the invisible structures of consciousness itself. Chapter 3, The Mirror Principle. As above, so below. One of the most mysterious sentences ever preserved from the ancient world contains only a few words, yet entire systems of metaphysics were built upon it. As above, so below. The phrase appears within the Emerald Tablet, a cryptic text attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. For centuries, alchemists, mystics, and philosophers studied those words as if they concealed a hidden mechanism behind reality itself. Most people interpreted them symbolically. The initiates believed they described law, According to Hermetic philosophy, patterns repeat across levels of existence. The inner world reflects outwardly. The invisible becomes visible. Thought influences emotion. Emotion influences behavior. Behavior influences consequence. Over time, what exists internally begins echoing externally with remarkable consistency. The ancients did not see this as magic, they saw it as correspondence. A bitter mind slowly creates bitter interactions. A fearful mind begins organizing life around avoidance. A peaceful mind notices possibilities hidden from panic. And eventually, emotional habits harden into lived conditions. This was the deeper meaning of the mirror principle. There is an old alchemical story about a man who traveled from city to city complaining that every place he entered was filled with dishonest people. In every town he encountered conflict. Every partnership collapsed. Every friendship ended with resentment. One evening, exhausted and angry, he stopped at a remote monastery where an elderly alchemist listened patiently to his frustrations. After hearing the man's story, the alchemist handed him a tarnished metal mirror. "What do you see?" he asked. "My reflection," the traveler answered. The alchemist breathed onto the surface, clouding the mirror with mist. "And now, only distortion." The old man nodded slowly. "Then understand this carefully. When the inner surface is distorted, the outer world appears distorted also." The traveler dismissed the statement at first, but years later he realized something unsettling. Every place he went, he carried the same internal assumptions, the same emotional wounds, the same defensive expectations. He believed the world was betraying him while unconsciously recreating the same conditions repeatedly through his reactions. This is how emotional patterns become destiny patterns, not instantly, gradually, silently. Ancient Hermetic initiates believed most human beings were trapped inside repetitive emotional cycles they mistook for reality itself. Fear created defensive perception. Defensive perception created reactive behavior. Reactive behavior produced conflict. Conflict reinforced fear. The cycle repeated until the emotional state became an identity. Eventually, people stopped noticing the pattern because it felt normal. Modern psychology now recognizes similar mechanisms through emotional conditioning and cognitive filtering. But ancient alchemists described it differently. They believed the base metals within human consciousness, fear, envy, rage, greed, despair, had to be transformed internally before life itself could change meaningfully. This was the true purpose of alchemy, not merely turning lead into gold, but turning unconsciousness into awareness. The outer symbols represented inner transformation. Gold symbolized refined consciousness, lead symbolized psychological heaviness, fire symbolized disciplined struggle. The ancient alchemist therefore worked upon himself first, because according to Hermetic understanding, the external world often mirrored unresolved internal structures. This is why two individuals can experience the same event yet emerge completely differently. One becomes wiser through suffering, the other becomes bitter. One discovers resilience, the other collapses inwardly. The event matters, but interpretation matters more over time. A Stoic philosopher and a Hermetic initiate would surprisingly agree on this point. The meaning assigned to experience often determines the quality of reality itself. There is another hidden layer inside the mirror principle that many overlook. External life not only reflects internal emotion, it reinforces it. Fear attracts confirming evidence. Gratitude notices opportunity. Cynicism interprets neutral events negatively. Optimism recognizes openings others ignore. The world begins responding to the dominant emotional atmosphere carried within consciousness, agon, not through fantasy, through perception, behavior, energy, and response. Ancient teachers understood that emotional reactions are rarely isolated moments. They are patterns rehearsed repeatedly until they become automatic. The angry person does not merely experience anger. He interprets reality through anger. The anxious person does not merely feel fear. She organizes perception around uncertainty. Over time, these internal states become invisible architects of external experience. That is why Hermetic schools trained initiates to master reaction before seeking power, because power amplified internal condition. A chaotic mind with influence created destruction. A disciplined mind with influence created order. The mirror always responds faithfully. This is why the practical lesson hidden inside, as above, so below, remains deeply important. Master internal reactions first. Before changing environments, observe emotional habits. Before blaming circumstances, observe recurring interpretations. Before seeking external transformation, notice the inner pattern being projected repeatedly into experience, because according to the ancient Hermetic understanding, life often reflects not merely what you desire, what you consistently embody, and the mirror never lies for long. Chapter 4, Marcus Aurelius and the Empire of the Mind. Imagine ruling an empire while surrounded by plague, betrayal, political instability, and endless war. This was the reality faced by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor whose private writings would later become the famous work Meditations. Yet what makes his story extraordinary is not simply the chaos around him, but the discipline within him. Marcus Aurelius lived during one of the most difficult periods in Roman history. Armies threatened the empire's borders, disease spread through cities, death surrounded daily life. Despite immense authority, he could not control most external events unfolding around him, and that realization became the foundation of his philosophy. Stoicism taught that external chaos is inevitable, but internal chaos is optional. This principle transformed Marcus Aurelius into something rare, a ruler who understood that true sovereignty begins within the mind. There is a moment recorded in Stoic tradition where Marcus reportedly walked through military camps filled with fear and exhaustion during wartime. Soldiers panicked over rumors of defeat. Advisors argued constantly. The atmosphere was emotionally contagious. Yet Marcus remained calm, not emotionally numb, disciplined. The difference mattered enormously. His stability influenced the emotional tone of everyone around him. Where others amplified panic, he transmitted steadiness. Ancient Stoics believed emotional states spread socially, much like fire spreads through dry grass. One disordered mind could destabilize many. One ordered mind could restore clarity. Marcus understood this deeply. He repeatedly wrote that suffering often arises not from events themselves, but from judgments about events. Two individuals can face identical hardship while experiencing entirely different internal realities. One collapses psychologically. The other becomes stronger through interpretation. This is one of Stoicism's most profound insights. Perception shapes experience. A storm remains a storm, but whether it becomes despair or challenge depends largely upon the consciousness interpreting it. The Stoics trained themselves relentlessly in this principle. They practiced observing emotional reactions before becoming consumed by them. Fear was acknowledged, but not obeyed automatically. Anger was recognized, but not allowed to dominate action. Anxiety was examined rather than worshipped. In modern terms, we might call this emotional regulation. The Stoics called it sovereignty. There is an ancient parable about a king who ruled two kingdoms simultaneously. One kingdom existed externally, his lands, armies, wealth, and political authority. The other existed internally, his thoughts, emotions, impulses, and perceptions. The king spent his life obsessively defending the external kingdom while neglecting the internal one. Over time, greed invaded the inner kingdom. Fear corrupted judgment. Anger poisoned perception. Eventually, the outer kingdom collapsed as well. The lesson was unmistakable. No one can rule externally while remaining internally conquered. Marcus Aurelius understood this truth intimately. His writings were not philosophical performances meant for public admiration. They were personal reminders written to himself during periods of immense pressure. Again and again he returned to one idea: maintain command over your inner world regardless of external instability. This did not mean denial of pain. It meant refusal to become enslaved by reaction. Modern life often encourages the opposite. Endless distraction, outrage cycles, fear-based media, and emotional overstimulation constantly pull attention outward. People become psychologically reactive to every external fluctuation. Their inner state rises and falls entirely according to circumstance. Stoicism offered another path: engage internally first, then engage externally. This is why Stoic emotional neutrality is often misunderstood. It does not mean coldness or indifference. It means clarity uncorrupted by emotional chaos. The ability to respond consciously rather than react impulsively. And over time, this internal order changes external life dramatically. Clearer perception improves decisions. Reduced panic improves timing. Emotional stability strengthens relationships. Calmness prevents self-destructive action during difficulty. The external world may remain unpredictable, but the internal empire becomes stable. This was the true power Marcus Aurelius cultivated: not domination over the world, domination over himself. And perhaps that is why his writings still resonate centuries later. Because beneath all philosophy, Stoicism speaks to a timeless human truth: the mind can become either a prison or a kingdom. Chapter 5, Thought as Invisible Architecture. There is a line in As a Man Thinketh that sounds almost too simple at first glance, yet it hides an entire metaphysical structure beneath it. A man is literally what he thinks all day long. Ancient philosophers would not have found this surprising. They believed thought was not just mental noise, but a kind of invisible architecture, something that quietly builds the structure of a life long before physical events ever appear. Imagine a city being constructed without anyone noticing, no loud announcement, no visible blueprint on display. Only subtle, repeated placement of bricks, day after day, until suddenly a complete structure exists. That is how thought operates in the human mind. Every repeated idea becomes a layer. Every repeated emotion becomes reinforcement. Every repeated interpretation becomes design. Over time, these layers stop feeling like choices and begin feeling like identity. Ancient Hermetic thinkers described this phenomenon as mental crystallization. The mind, they believed, does not simply have thoughts, it becomes shaped by them. What you repeatedly think begins to think itself through you. This is why two people can live in the same environment, yet experience entirely different realities. One person sees opportunity, another sees limitation. One anticipates possibility, another anticipates failure. The external world is not different, but the internal architecture is. And that internal architecture quietly organizes perception, decision-making, and behavior. A merchant in an old Mediterranean tale once studied under a desert sage. The merchant complained that wealth always slipped away from him, no matter how hard he worked. The sage did not give him financial advice. Instead, he asked the merchant to repeat every thought he had about money for 3 days without changing anything. After the 3rd day, the sage nodded. "You do not lose wealth," he said. "You build a mind that releases it." The merchant had been unconsciously rehearsing thoughts of scarcity, mistrust, and instability for years. Every opportunity was filtered through suspicion. Every gain was followed by fear of loss. His external actions were constantly undermined by internal repetition. This is the hidden structure most people never see. Thought becomes habit, habit becomes perception, perception becomes behavior, behavior becomes outcome, and yet the origin point is almost always invisible. Ancient Stoics understood a similar mechanism but described it differently. They believed impressions enter the mind constantly, like visitors entering a marketplace. Some impressions are harmless, others are destructive, but without discipline, the mind accepts all of them as truth. This is where suffering begins, not in events, but in unexamined repetition. Modern psychology now confirms what ancient traditions suspected. Repeated thoughts strengthen neural pathways. The brain literally reinforces what it rehearses most. But ancient mystics went further. They believed repeated thought also shapes emotional tone, which then influences the field of experience a person moves through. Whether one interprets this literally or symbolically, the lived result is the same. What you repeat internally eventually organizes your external reality. The danger is not a single negative thought. The danger is unconscious repetition. A thought that returns so often it becomes invisible. At that point, it no longer feels like thinking, it feels like truth. That is why ancient teachings place so much emphasis on awareness. To see thought clearly is to interrupt its automatic authority. To interrupt thought is to weaken its structure, and to weaken repetition is to loosen identity itself. There is a simple but powerful practice hidden in many traditions. Observe the mind without immediate identification, not to suppress thought, but to recognize its patterning. Because once a pattern is seen clearly, it begins to lose its unconscious control. A thought cannot fully dominate what is being consciously witnessed. This is the beginning of mental freedom. And it is also the beginning of change, because when invisible architecture shifts, visible reality eventually follows. Chapter 6, The Subconscious Mind and Hidden Metaphysical Power. There is a quieter layer beneath thought itself, and ancient teachings consistently pointed toward it. Modern psychology calls it the subconscious. Mystical traditions described it as the deeper receptive intelligence of the soul. In the teachings of Joseph Murphy, this layer is not passive, it is deeply responsive. It does not argue, it does not analyze. It simply accepts the emotional quality of repeated impressions and begins to organize behavior around them. In other words, the subconscious does not respond primarily to logic. It responds to feeling. A belief repeated with emotional intensity becomes instruction. This is why people often find themselves living out patterns they intellectually disagree with. The conscious mind may desire change, but the subconscious continues operating from older emotional programming. Ancient initiatory traditions understood this long before neuroscience. In Egyptian mystery schools, students were not merely taught ideas, they were immersed in ritual, repetition, symbol, and emotional experience designed to impress deeper layers of consciousness. They believed transformation could not occur through intellectual agreement alone. It required emotional encoding. A story from Hermetic tradition describes a novice entering a temple seeking hidden wisdom. He expected secrets of power, language, or ritual. Instead, the priest led him into a dark chamber filled with mirrors. For days he was told nothing, only to observe. At first he became restless, then frustrated, then fearful. Over time he began noticing patterns in his own reactions, how quickly emotions rose, how easily perception distorted, how thoughts repeated themselves without control. Finally, the priest returned and said, "You were not being taught knowledge, you were being shown your own programming." This reflects a core truth shared across mystical traditions. The subconscious is shaped through repetition, emotion, and identity alignment. It does not change because of desire. It changes because of consistent internal impression. This is why belief is not merely intellectual. Belief is emotional repetition accepted as identity. When someone repeatedly imagines themselves in limitation, even unconsciously, the subconscious begins to organize behavior around that identity. Opportunities are overlooked, risks are avoided, choices become constrained without conscious awareness. The external world then appears to confirm the internal state. But the direction of influence began inward. This is where ancient metaphysical systems and modern psychology converge. Whether described as subconscious programming or spiritual conditioning, the mechanism is similar. Inner impressions gradually become outer expression. However, ancient teachings also emphasized something more important than diagnosis. They emphasized intentional impression. If the subconscious is receptive, then it can be guided. If it is shaped by repetition, then repetition becomes a tool. If it responds to emotional imagery, then imagination becomes a form of training. This is where mystical practice enters practical life. The disciplined use of attention, visualization, and emotional state becomes a method of restructuring internal reality before external results appear. But there is an important distinction. Forcing the mind creates resistance. Ancient traditions warned that manipulation of the subconscious must align with internal coherence, not conflict. Otherwise, the system fragments. True transformation occurs when thought, feeling, and identity begin to move in the same direction. At that point, subconscious alignment becomes natural rather than forced. And when subconscious alignment stabilizes, behavior shifts without struggle. Circumstances begin to reorganize not through magic, but through consistent internal direction expressing itself outwardly. This is why ancient teachings repeatedly return to one central idea. Do not only change what you think, chant what you consistently feel. Because feeling is the language the deeper mind understands most clearly. And once that language changes, architecture of reality slowly begins to follow. Chapter 7, Neville Goddard and the Law of Assumption. There is a quiet but radical idea buried in the teachings of Neville Goddard. Reality does not begin outside you. It begins as assumption within you, not hope, not wishful thinking. But assumption. To assume something is to inhabit it internally so completely that your consciousness begins to behave as if it is already true. And according to this tradition, the outer world is not the initiator of experience, it is the echo. In ancient mystical language, imagination was never treated as fantasy. It was treated as the first layer of creation. Long before modern psychology, Hermetic thinkers already hinted at this mechanism. They believed consciousness does not merely observe reality, it organizes it from within. What you consistently imagine and emotionally accept becomes the blueprint your perception follows. A traveler's parable from an old mystical manuscript describes a young man who wandered into a distant city seeking fortune. He carried no wealth, only a single belief. I am already destined for ruin. At first, nothing in the city confirmed this belief. Opportunities existed, conversations were open, people were welcoming. But slowly, the young man's assumption began to shape his interpretation of everything. A neutral glance became suspicion, a delay became rejection, a small setback became confirmation of failure. The city did not change, his consciousness did. This is the hidden mechanism behind the law of assumption. Perception does not passively record reality, it filters it through identity, and identity is shaped internally long before circumstances appear externally. Neville Goddard emphasized something even more subtle. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is the creative moment. Not the thought alone, but the emotional occupancy of a state. Feeling is not passive, it is structural. It tells consciousness, this is already real. When repeated consistently, perception reorganizes itself around that inner instruction. Modern psychology mirrors this idea in different language. The brain prioritizes familiar patterns. It begins to notice what aligns with dominant internal expectations. But mystical traditions went further. They believed imagination is not only psychological, but ontological, meaning it participates in the formation of experience itself. A merchant in an ancient story once visited a secluded teacher in the desert. He asked how to change his fortune. The teacher did not give strategies. Instead, he asked the merchant to close his eyes and vividly experience himself already living in the life he desired. The merchant resisted. "But it is not real," he said. The teacher replied, "Then you are practicing reality incorrectly." This statement captures the essence of assumption. Reality is not only what is observed, it is what is repeatedly inhabited internally. When someone assumes lack, they rehearse limitation. When someone assumes abundance, they rehearse possibility. Over time, the subconscious begins to align behavior with the dominant internal script. But there is a crucial nuance. Assumption is not denial of present reality. It is the reorganization of identity in spite of it. Ancient initiatory systems often used symbolic rituals for this reason. They understood that identity shifts through embodied repetition. Wearing a symbolic role, speaking from it, feeling it internally, these were not theatrical acts. They were psychological reprogramming tools. Today, the same principle appears in visualization, meditation, and cognitive rehearsal. But the ancient framing was more direct. You become what you consistently assume yourself to be. This is why emotional rehearsal matters. Not passive thinking, but repeated inner occupancy. A life does not change because of occasional inspiration. It changes when assumption becomes habitual identity. And once identity stabilizes, perception follows. And once perception follows, experience reorganizes itself. The outer world becomes the delayed reflection of an inner state already accepted as real. This is the silent architecture behind transformation. And it begins not with action, but with assumption. A quiet internal decision. I am already that, even before the world agrees. Chapter 8, Carl Jung and the Shadow Within. There is a deeper layer beneath assumption itself, and it is not always comfortable to face. The psychologist Carl Jung called it the shadow. It is the part of consciousness we do not easily recognize, hidden fears, suppressed impulses, denied emotions, and forgotten aspects of the self that still influence behavior from beneath awareness. In Jung's exploration, especially within the Red Book, he described encounters with inner figures that seemed almost autonomous, symbols, voices, and emotional forces that behaved like independent intelligences within the psyche. To modern readers, this may sound symbolic, but psychologically it points to something very real. Much of human behavior is driven by unconscious content. We do not always act from what we know. We often act from what we have not faced. A man may consciously desire success, yet unconsciously fear visibility. A person may seek love, yet unconsciously expect rejection. These contradictions do not appear as thoughts, they appear as patterns. Repeated self-sabotage, unexplained resistance, emotional reactions that feel too strong for the situation. These are not random errors, they are shadow expressions. Ancient traditions understood this in different language. They spoke of inner demons, not as external entities, but as unintegrated aspects of consciousness. When ignored, these aspects do not disappear. They influence decisions indirectly. Jung believed the psyche seeks wholeness. Anything rejected by awareness does not vanish. It compensates, often through projection. We see in others what we have not integrated in ourselves. A story from a desert mystic tradition tells of a seeker who blamed the world for his suffering. He believed enemies surrounded him. Betrayal followed him everywhere. One day, an old guide led him into a dark cave and asked him to describe what he saw. The seeker saw shadows moving. He became afraid. The guide placed a torch behind him. Suddenly, the shadows shifted. He realized they were not separate entities, but distortions of his own form projected onto the cave walls. The guide said, "You have been fighting reflections. This mirrors Jung's insight. Much of what we resist externally is amplified internally. The shadow is not evil. It is unintegrated awareness. And when it remains unconscious, it influences behavior without permission." This is why emotional triggers are so important. They are not just reactions, they are entry points into hidden material. A disproportionate emotional response often signals a deeper pattern beneath surface awareness. Ancient initiates practiced forms of self-observation for this reason. They understood that transformation begins when unconscious content becomes visible. Once seen, it begins to lose automatic control. A reactive pattern cannot fully dominate what is consciously recognized. But Jung warned, seeing the shadow is not enough. Integration is required. Otherwise, awareness becomes fragmented insight without transformation. Integration means acknowledging denied parts of oneself without immediate rejection. Fear, anger, insecurity, desire, all are energy patterns. When brought into awareness, they stop operating in the dark. And when they stop operating in the dark, they stop controlling outcomes indirectly. This is where psychological depth becomes practical reality. Because many repeating life patterns are not caused by external conditions, they are caused by internal divisions. One part of the mind wants expansion, another part fears it, one part seeks change, another part preserves identity. The result is conflict expressed as stagnation. Jung's work reveals a difficult truth. External life often reflects internal fragmentation more accurately than conscious intention, but it also reveals a path forward, not suppression, not avoidance, but awareness. To observe the shadow is to begin reclaiming lost energy, and reclaimed energy becomes clarity. Clarity becomes choice. Choice becomes direction, and direction slowly reshapes reality from the inside outward. In the end, both assumption and shadow work point toward the same truth. Nothing external changes sustainably until something internal is seen clearly enough to stop controlling you unseen. Chapter 9. The Ancient Secret of Attention. Have you ever noticed how your entire day follows what you couldn't stop thinking about in the morning? Not what you planned, not what you intended, but what captured your attention first and held it longest. Ancient initiates considered this one of the most important hidden laws of consciousness. Attention is not passive observation, It is directional force. Where attention goes, energy organizes. This principle appears indirectly in Hermetic teachings, Stoic discipline, and mystical schools across civilizations. But it was never written as a casual idea. It was treated like a guarded key to inner power. Because attention is not just mental activity, it is selection. And selection creates experience. In ancient temple traditions, particularly those influenced by early Hermetic culture, students were trained not first in knowledge, but in sustained concentration. They would sit for long hours observing a single object, a flame, a symbol, or even their own breath, not as ritual alone, but as discipline against fragmentation. The goal was not silence for its own sake, it was control over scattered awareness. A fragmented mind, they believed, cannot shape reality with coherence. It reacts instead of directs. It absorbs instead of selects. It moves constantly but creates nothing stable. Modern life amplifies this fragmentation endlessly. Notifications interrupt thought. Media reshapes emotion. Algorithms compete for awareness. And slowly, attention becomes something owned externally rather than governed internally. Ancient teachers would have called this a loss of sovereignty. There is a forgotten parable about a young apprentice who entered a monastery seeking mystical knowledge. He expected secret teachings, rituals, or hidden words of power. Instead, the master assigned him a simple task. For 1 month, he was to watch the movement of a single stone placed in the courtyard. Nothing else. At first, the apprentice became frustrated. His mind wandered constantly. He wanted deeper instruction. He wanted meaning. But the master refused to add anything. After days of struggle, something unexpected happened. The apprentice began noticing how quickly his mind moved between thoughts. He realized he had been living in constant internal distraction without awareness. He also noticed that when attention stabilized, his emotional reactions slowed, and his perception sharpened. At the end of the month, the master finally spoke. "You came seeking hidden knowledge, but you could not first hold your own mind still enough to receive it." This is the core of the ancient teaching. Attention is the gateway through which reality is interpreted. Modern psychology echoes this through cognitive focus and selective attention theory. Whatever you consistently focus on becomes mentally amplified. But mystical traditions went further. They believed attention does not only reveal reality, it participates in shaping how reality is experienced. This is why two people can witness the same event and remember entirely different versions. Their attention filtered different aspects. One saw threat, the other saw opportunity. One registered loss, the other registered learning. The event was identical, the experience was not, because attention was not identical. In Hermetic thought, this was not incidental, it was foundational. The mind was seen as a field of potential, and attention as the organizing force within that field. Where attention rests, structure forms. Where attention fragments, structure dissolves. This is why focus is often described in ancient teachings as a form of power, not in the sense of control over others, but control over internal coherence. A scattered mind leaks energy constantly. A focused mind gathers it, and gathered energy becomes decisive action. The action step hidden in this principle is simple but demanding. Reclaim scattered attention daily, not once in a while, not during meditation retreats, but in ordinary life, especially in moments of distraction, emotional reactivity, and mental overload, because attention is trained not in stillness alone, but in resistance to fragmentation. And every time attention is reclaimed, something subtle strengthens clarity. Chapter 10, The Law of Emotional Vibration. There is a moment in every human life when emotion becomes stronger than logic. In that moment, perception changes instantly. A neutral situation becomes threatening. A delay becomes rejection. A challenge becomes failure. Nothing outside has changed, but everything inside has shifted. Ancient Hermetic philosophers observed this phenomenon closely. In teachings associated with the Kybalion, they described reality as influenced by vibration, not merely physical vibration, but emotional and mental states that shape perception and experience. Emotion in this framework was not just reaction, it was frequency. A person dominated by fear does not simply feel fear, they interpret reality through fear. Their attention selects danger, their memory reinforces threat. Their imagination projects worst-case outcomes. Over time, this emotional state becomes a lens that reshapes experience itself. A traveler in an old mystical story once asked a desert sage why two people walking the same path saw entirely different worlds. One saw abundance in small things. The other saw scarcity everywhere. The sage answered, "They are not walking the same path. They are walking different states of being." This is the essence of emotional vibration, not mystical abstraction, psychological reality. Modern neuroscience confirms that emotional states influence perception, decision-making, and memory recall. But ancient traditions framed it more broadly. Emotion organizes consciousness into patterns, and those patterns determine how life is interpreted moment to moment. This is why Stoic philosophy, especially in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, emphasized emotional discipline as a form of inner governance. If emotion is left unchecked, perception becomes unstable. If perception is unstable, decisions become reactive, and reactive decisions accumulate into unstable life conditions. Emotion, therefore, is not neutral. It is formative, but ancient teachings also made a crucial distinction. Emotions are not enemies. They are energy states. They become destructive only when unconscious. Fear, when unconscious, shrinks perception. Fear, when observed, becomes awareness. Anger, when unconscious, becomes impulsive destruction. Anger, when observed, becomes fuel for change. This is why ancient traditions often included rituals, not for superstition, but for emotional training. Controlled environments, repetitive chants, breath regulation, symbolic acts, all designed to stabilize internal state and reduce emotional volatility. They understood something modern life often ignores. An unstable emotional frequency produces unstable interpretation of reality, and unstable interpretation produces unstable outcomes. This is not punishment, it is pattern. A person living in chronic anxiety will not only feel anxiety, they will begin organizing life around avoidance. A person living in gratitude will begin noticing opportunities others overlook, not because the world changes instantly, but because perception becomes tuned differently. Emotion acts like a filter. It amplifies certain signals and hides others. This is why emotional mastery was considered essential in both Hermetic and Stoic traditions. Not suppression, but stabilization. To stabilize emotion is to stabilize perception. To stabilize perception is to stabilize decisions. To stabilize decisions is to stabilize life trajectory. The practical action embedded in this law is simple but powerful. Stabilize your emotional frequency. Not by forcing positivity, but by observing emotional fluctuations without becoming fully identified with them, by recognizing that emotion is movement, not identity. Ancient initiates would say, "You are not the wave, you are the awareness beneath it," and when awareness stabilizes, emotion no longer controls reality interpretation, it begins to inform it consciously instead. Chapter 11, The Prison of Unconscious Identity. There is a harder truth buried beneath all ancient wisdom traditions, one that most people only confront when life repeatedly refuses to change no matter how much effort they apply. You do not experience life directly. You experience life through identity, not who you think you are for a moment, but who you have repeatedly told yourself you are over years of internal repetition. Ancient initiates understood this long before psychology gave it language. They observed a simple but unsettling pattern. A person's outer world stabilizes around their inner self-definition. If someone silently carries the identity of failure, life eventually organizes itself to match that expectation, not through mystical punishment, but through interpretation, behavior, and repeated decision-making. This is why traditions influenced by Hermetic thought, including teachings preserved in the Kybalion, repeatedly emphasized that consciousness is not passive, it is formative, and identity is its most stable expression. A man in an old desert parable once traveled to a temple seeking liberation from his suffering. He told the elder priest, "My life is cursed. Everything I touch collapses." The priest listened quietly, then asked, "What do you call yourself?" The man hesitated. "Unlucky," he said. The priest nodded slowly. "And how long have you called yourself that?" The man paused longer than expected. "As long as I can remember." The priest replied, "Then your life is not cursed. It is consistent. This is the hidden mechanism of identity. It is reinforced not by events, but by repetition. Self-labels become internal instructions. I am not good with money. I always fail at relationships. Nothing ever works for me. At first these are emotional expressions, but repeated often enough, they become unconscious frameworks that guide perception and behavior. The mind begins selecting evidence that confirms identity and filtering out evidence that contradicts it. Over time, identity becomes prophecy, not because reality is fixed, but because attention is filtered. Ancient initiates were trained to recognize this early. They believed transformation could not begin with external change, because external change would always be interpreted through existing identity structures. Instead, they worked at the root level. Internal self-definition. To change destiny, they first changed the story being silently repeated inside the mind. This aligns with psychological observation. Identity drives behavior more consistently than intention. A person may desire success, but if their identity is rooted in inadequacy, they will unconsciously sabotage opportunities that conflict with that identity. This is why repetition is so powerful. Not dramatic repetition, but subtle, daily reinforcement. Every internal statement strengthens identity architecture. Every emotional response reinforces self-perception. Every habitual reaction deepens the internal narrative, and eventually personality becomes a hardened structure built from countless unnoticed repetitions. The danger is not that identity exists. The danger is that it operates unconsciously. Ancient teachings, therefore, placed enormous importance on awareness of self-talk. Because internal language is not neutral, it is formative instruction. It tells consciousness what to expect, what to allow, and what to avoid. This is why Hermetic philosophy insisted that mastery begins internally, not in controlling events, but in observing the identity through which events are interpreted, because when identity shifts, perception shifts. And when perception shifts, behavior follows. And when behavior follows consistently, outcomes begin to reorganize themselves naturally. The action hidden in this chapter is deceptively simple. Rewrite internal self-language, not occasionally, not theoretically, but consistently enough to interrupt old identity loops. Replace unconscious declarations with conscious ones, not as fantasy, but as deliberate reprogramming of internal narrative, because identity is not fixed. It is rehearsed, and what is rehearsed long enough becomes reality. Chapter 12. Silence as metaphysical power. In a world saturated with noise, silence has become almost unnatural, yet across ancient traditions, from Stoic philosophy to Hermetic schools to monastic disciplines, silence was never treated as absence. It was treated as access to perception, access to clarity, access to deeper layers of consciousness normally drowned out by mental activity. The Stoics, including Marcus Aurelius in his Reflections within Meditations, often returned to the idea that the mind becomes distorted when overwhelmed by unnecessary internal noise. For them, silence was not retreat from life, it was refinement of perception within life. Ancient Hermetic initiates practiced similar disciplines. In temple environments, silence was not occasional, it was structured. Students were placed in controlled isolation periods, not as punishment, but as training. Without constant speech, external stimulation, or reactive conversation, attention begins to turn inward, and when attention turns inward, something subtle happens. Patterns become visible in everyday life. Most mental patterns remain invisible because they are constantly interrupted. Thought follows thought without pause. Emotion follows emotion without reflection. Reaction replaces observation, but in silence, the continuity breaks, and what remains becomes observable. A monk in an old tradition once described silence as the mirror of the mind. At first it feels empty, then it becomes uncomfortable. Eventually, it becomes revealing. Thoughts that normally pass unnoticed begin to surface. Emotional residues emerge. Hidden assumptions become visible. This is why silence is powerful, not because it adds something new, but because it removes interference. Modern life often moves in the opposite direction. Continuous input, continuous reaction, continuous stimulation. Over time, this weakens perception, not because the mind becomes less intelligent, but because it becomes less stable. Ancient teachings warn that noise does not merely distract, it fragments awareness. And fragmented awareness cannot perceive subtle patterns, it only reacts to source movement. Silence restores coherence. There is a story preserved in contemplative traditions about a student who complained that he could not understand mystical teachings. The master instructed him to sit alone in silence for several days without speaking or seeking distraction. At first, the student felt nothing but discomfort, then irritation, then resistance. But after extended silence, something changed. He began noticing subtle patterns in his own thoughts, how quickly the mind jumps to judgment, how easily it seeks distraction, how often it avoids stillness. When he returned, the master asked, "What did you learn?" The student replied, "I learned I was not listening before. This is the core function of silence. It reveals what noise conceals. And what noise conceals is often the very structure shaping experience. In Hermetic and Stoic traditions, silence was therefore considered a form of metaphysical power, not because it manipulates reality, but because it restores accurate perception of it. When perception becomes clearer, decisions become more aligned. When decisions become more aligned, life begins to stabilize. Silence is not emptiness. It is subtraction of distortion. The action hidden in this principle is simple but rarely practiced. Practice intentional silence daily, not escape, not avoidance, but deliberate removal of noise long enough for awareness to reset. Even short periods can reveal patterns normally hidden beneath constant mental activity, because when silence deepens, perception sharpens. And when perception sharpens, reality is no longer interpreted through distortion, but through clarity. Chapter 13. Synchronicity and the Responsive Universe. There are moments in life that refuse to feel accidental. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call within the hour. You open a book at random and find a sentence that answers a question you never voiced aloud. You walk into a place for the first time and feel as if you've already been there. Most people dismiss these moments as coincidence, but across ancient mystical traditions and later in the psychological work of Carl Jung, these experiences were treated differently. Jung called them meaningful coincidences, synchronicities that appear when inner states and outer events align in a way that feels charged with significance. He did not claim they were magical in a simplistic sense. He suggested something more subtle. Reality may not be random at the level of experience, but organized through patterns that consciousness is capable of perceiving when attention becomes refined. Ancient Hermetic thinkers would have agreed, though they would have expressed it differently. To them, the universe was not a passive backdrop. It was responsive, an interconnected field where inner focus and outer events often mirrored each other in unexpected ways. A traveler in an old mystical parable once wandered through a desert searching for guidance. For weeks, nothing unusual happened. The world felt silent and indifferent. Then, over the course of a single day, he encountered 3 strangers who independently told him the same message. You are not lost. You are being corrected. The traveler was shaken, not because of superstition, but because of repetition. 3 unrelated moments carrying the same theme. To him, it felt like the world had begun speaking in patterns. Ancient teachings would interpret this not as external manipulation, but as heightened perception. When attention becomes focused, it begins to notice relationships between events that were always present but previously ignored. This is the first layer of synchronicity. Awareness reveals connection, but there is a deeper layer as well. When internal focus becomes strong and emotionally coherent, perception itself becomes selective. The mind begins to notice patterns aligned with its dominant concerns. This does not mean reality is artificially created. It means reality is filtered through consciousness that is no longer random in attention. A grieving person notices reminders of loss everywhere. A hopeful person notices openings everywhere. A fearful person detects threat everywhere. The outer world contains all of these possibilities simultaneously. But attention selects which layer becomes meaningful. Ancient mystics interpreted this as a form of dialogue between consciousness and reality, not in a literal conversational sense, but as an unfolding correspondence between inner state and external experience. The more coherent the inner state, the more coherent the perceived external pattern appears. This is why synchronicities often increase during periods of emotional intensity, transformation, or deep reflection. The mind is reorganizing itself, and perception begins to reflect that internal reorganization. A story preserved in contemplative tradition describes a young initiate who was told to focus intensely on a single question: what is guiding my life? At first, nothing changed. But after several days of focused contemplation, unusual coincidences began appearing. Conversations echoed his question. Symbols repeated in different places. Even ordinary events felt unusually aligned. When he reported this to his teacher, the response was simple: you are not seeing more of reality. You are seeing more of what you are aligned to notice. This does not diminish the experience, it reframes it. Synchronicity becomes less about external control and more about internal coherence shaping perception. Modern psychology offers a parallel explanation through selective attention and pattern recognition. But ancient frameworks add something deeper. Meaning itself becomes more visible when consciousness is organized. The action embedded in this principle is simple yet powerful. Record synchronicities for 7 days. Not to interpret them immediately, but to observe patterns in attention. What themes repeat? What emotional states accompany them? What questions seem to attract responses? Because what is recorded is what begins to become conscious, and what becomes conscious begins to reorganize internal structure. Chapter 14, The Law of Cause and Effect. There is an ancient warning that appears across Hermetic philosophy in various forms. Nothing emerges without cause, even if the cause is invisible. This principle, often referred to as causality within Hermetic teaching traditions like the Kybalion, suggests that visible outcomes are always preceded by invisible processes. What appears sudden is often the result of repetition. What appears accidental is often the result of accumulated patterns. In other words, life does not suddenly change direction, it slowly builds toward it. Ancient initiates understood this deeply. They observed that small internal habits, thoughts, emotional reactions, decisions repeated without awareness, gradually construct future conditions. Not through mystical punishment or reward, but through steady accumulation of causes. A forgotten parable describes a farmer who complained that his land had become barren. He insisted that misfortune had struck his fields without warning. An elder visited him and examined his work. The farmer was confused when the elder did not inspect the soil or the weather, but instead observed his daily habits. The elder asked, "When did you last tend the soil carefully?" The farmer replied, "I stopped noticing small things. They seemed unimportant." The elder nodded. "That is where your harvest ended long before you noticed." This reflects the hidden truth of causality. Outcomes are not born in moments of crisis. They are shaped in moments of repetition. Modern psychology echoes this through habit formation and behavioral conditioning. But ancient metaphysical traditions extended the idea further. Repetition does not only shape behavior, it shapes probability fields of experience. What you repeatedly think, feel, and do becomes the silent architecture of what is likely to happen next. A single decision rarely defines a life, but repeated small decisions do. Skipping discipline once changes little. Skipping it consistently changes trajectory. A single fearful thought is harmless. A repeated fearful narrative becomes identity. A single generous act is meaningful. A repeated generous pattern becomes abundant circulation. This is why ancient teachings emphasized vigilance over small actions, because invisible causes accumulate long before visible effects appear. Stoic philosophy, as reflected in Marcus Aurelius, also returns repeatedly to this principle. The mind is shaped not by grand intentions alone, but by consistent internal discipline. Even in his personal writings within Meditations, he reminds himself that character is built through repeated choices, not occasional insight. The same applies outwardly. What you repeatedly tolerate becomes your environment. What you repeatedly ignore becomes your limitation. What you repeatedly practice becomes your destiny. Ancient Hermetic thinkers would say, effect is simply cause delayed in time. This shifts responsibility from dramatic events to subtle patterns. It removes the illusion of sudden change. And it returns power to daily discipline. Because if outcomes are shaped by repetition, then transformation does not require extraordinary action. It requires consistent alignment of small actions with desired direction. The action embedded in this law is deceptively simple. Master tiny disciplines consistently, not intense bursts of effort, not emotional resolutions, but quiet, repeated alignment between intention and behavior, because in the long arc of time, it is not the dramatic moment that defines destiny, it is the invisible repetition that builds it long before it is seen. Chapter 15. Why most minds remain powerless. There is a quieter form of exhaustion most people never recognize. It is not physical fatigue. It is not even emotional burnout in the obvious sense. It is the slow scattering of inner energy through constant reaction. Ancient traditions would have called this the loss of mental sovereignty. In Hermetic and Stoic thought traditions, preserved in fragments like the Kybalion, and reflected in the inner discipline of Marcus Aurelius, the mind was not treated as a passive container of thoughts, but as a field of force, a field that could either be concentrated into clarity or fragmented into weakness. Most people, they observed, live in fragmentation, not because they lack intelligence, but because their attention is constantly pulled outward, reacting to stimuli faster than awareness can stabilize. Fear, urgency, comparison, distraction, emotional triggers, each one acts like a small fracture in consciousness. One alone seems insignificant, but together they create a mind that is always moving, never centered. And a mind that is always moving cannot hold power long enough to shape direction. There is an old desert teaching story about a traveler who sought guidance from a hidden order of initiates. He believed they possessed secret techniques of influence over reality. When he finally reached their sanctuary, he expected rituals, teachings, or symbols of power. Instead, he was placed in a simple room with no objects except a single bowl of water. The elder told him only this: "Stay here until the water becomes still." At first the traveler was confused. He waited a few minutes, then grew restless. He began to think the task was symbolic, so he stirred the water to test it. The surface became chaotic. He waited again. Stillness never lasted. Days passed. The traveler realized something uncomfortable. The water reflected his own state. Every movement of impatience, every internal disturbance, every urge to escape, it all showed up in the surface. Finally, exhausted, he stopped trying to force stillness. He simply observed without interference. Slowly, the water settled. And in that stillness he saw his reflection clearly for the first time. When he returned to the elder, the teacher said, "You were not watching the water, you were watching your mind." This parable captures a principle modern life has nearly forgotten. Power does not come from more activity. It comes from reduced internal fragmentation, but contemporary society is designed in the opposite direction. It rewards reaction over reflection. It rewards speed over depth. It rewards attention scattering over attention mastery. Over time, this creates a subtle internal condition, emotional exhaustion without visible cause. The mind becomes saturated with inputs but starved of coherence. Ancient initiates understood this vulnerability deeply. They did not protect themselves from information alone. They protected themselves from constant emotional reactivity, because they knew that every unprocessed reaction consumes energy, not physical energy, cognitive and emotional energy, the very fuel of clarity, decision-making, and perception. A mind drained of this energy still functions, but only reactively. It responds to life instead of shaping it. It becomes a responder, not a creator of direction. This is why many ancient systems emphasized controlled environments, silence, structured routines, limited exposure to chaotic influence, not as isolation, but as preservation of mental coherence. Because they recognized something simple but profound. A scattered mind cannot generate sustained influence over reality. Only coherence can, and coherence requires protection. The action hidden in this understanding is direct. Protect mental energy aggressively, not passively, not occasionally, but as a disciplined boundary against unnecessary fragmentation. Every unnecessary emotional reaction, every compulsive attention shift, every unfiltered input reduces clarity. And clarity is the foundation of conscious influence. Chapter 16, The Alchemy of Emotional Transmutation. There is a deeper possibility hidden within emotional experience that most people never realize. Emotion does not have to be suppressed, it can be transformed. Ancient Hermetic teachings referred to this process as mental alchemy, the ability to change the internal state of emotion without denying its existence. In symbolic language preserved in texts like the Kybalion, the mind was understood as capable of transmuting lower emotional states into higher forms of directed awareness. Modern psychology might describe this as emotional regulation or cognitive reframing. But ancient teachings went further. They believed emotional energy is neutral in essence, but directional in use. It becomes destructive only when unconscious. It becomes creative when consciously directed. A vivid example appears in many warrior traditions of antiquity. A young soldier once trained under a strict commander known for his emotional discipline. During one battle simulation, the soldier was provoked intentionally by his instructor. Insults were used, pressure was applied, frustration was triggered. The soldier reacted explosively. He lost control of his movements. The simulation ended immediately. Afterward, the commander did not punish him. Instead, he asked, "Where did your energy go?" The soldier realized something unsettling. The anger he felt did not disappear. It scattered. It moved into reaction, tension, and loss of precision. His strength was not reduced, it was fragmented. The commander then said, "Emotion is not your enemy. Undirected emotion is." This reflects the core principle of transmutation. Emotion must be redirected, not resisted. Fear, when untransformed, produces paralysis. Fear, when observed and stabilized, becomes heightened awareness. Anger, when unconscious, creates destruction. Anger, when redirected, becomes disciplined action. Sadness, when suppressed, becomes heaviness. Sadness, when processed, becomes depth of perception. This is the hidden science of emotional transformation, not elimination, reorganization. Stoic philosophy, as practiced in the discipline of Marcus Aurelius, often points toward this principle. In reflective writings like Meditations, emotional disturbances are not treated as external problems, but as internal interpretations that can be restructured through awareness. What changes is not the event, but the meaning assigned to it, and meaning determines emotional state, and emotional state determines action, and action determines outcome. This chain is rarely broken because emotion usually operates faster than reflection. But when awareness enters the emotional process, something subtle happens. The energy becomes available for direction instead of reaction. Ancient traditions often used breath, pause, and symbolic interruption to create this gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, transmutation becomes possible. The emotion is still present, but it is no longer controlling movement. It becomes raw material, a force that can be shaped, a fire that can either burn blindly or forge deliberately. This is why emotional mastery was never about numbness in ancient teachings. It was about precision. A trained consciousness does not avoid emotional energy. It learns to redirect it. The action embedded in this principle is simple but powerful. Use emotional energy consciously. When emotion arises, do not immediately discharge it into reaction. Pause. Observe its direction. Then redirect it into clarity, decision, or constructive action, because emotional energy is not the problem. Unconscious emotional direction is, and once direction becomes conscious, emotion stops being a disturbance. It becomes fuel. Chapter 17, The Return to Inner Sovereignty. There is a point in every search for truth where the question quietly changes. At first, a person asks, "How do I change my life?" Later, if they go deep enough, the question becomes, "Who is the part of me that is experiencing this life?" Ancient traditions suggest that this shift is not philosophical, it is structural. It marks the moment a human being stops seeing themselves as a passive recipient of events and begins to recognize themselves as a participant in the formation of experience. In the language of Hermetic philosophy, this participation is alignment with the logos, the underlying ordering intelligence described across texts like Corpus Hermeticum and later echoed in symbolic form within the Kybalion. Not a distant force, but an organizing principle expressed through consciousness itself. In simpler terms, reality is not something happening to awareness. It is something happening through awareness, and this changes everything. A forgotten teaching story speaks of a young seeker who spent years trying to master external conditions. He tried changing his location, his relationships, his work, his routines. Each change gave temporary relief, but the same patterns eventually returned in different forms. Frustrated, he visited an old hermit who lived outside the city. He asked, "Why does my life keep repeating itself, even when everything around me changes?" The hermit replied, "Because you have been rearranging the reflection without touching the source." The seeker did not understand, so the hermit led him to a still lake at dawn. The surface was calm, perfectly reflective. The hermit asked him to describe what he saw. The seeker said, "I see the sky, the trees, the world." Then the hermit disturbed the water with a single movement. The reflection broke into fragments. "What do you see now?" he asked. "Distortion," the seeker replied. The hermit said quietly, "The world you experience is not fixed. It is a reflection of the state beneath it." This is the return to inner sovereignty, not control over events, but clarity over the source from which events are interpreted. In Stoic tradition, especially in the reflections of Marcus Aurelius within Meditations, this principle appears as a constant reminder. External events are neutral until interpreted by the mind. It is the inner structure that determines whether experience becomes suffering or strength. But the deeper Hermetic view goes further. It suggests that inner order does not merely interpret reality. It participates in shaping the pattern of experience itself through sustained attention, emotional coherence, and identity stability. When the inner system is fragmented, external life appears chaotic. When the inner system is stable, external life appears more intelligible, even during uncertainty. This does not mean life becomes perfect. It means perception becomes aligned, and alignment changes everything, because once consciousness stabilizes internally, it stops reacting randomly to external fluctuation. It begins responding from a coherent center. Decisions become less impulsive, emotions become less scattered, attention becomes more intentional, and over time, this creates a subtle but powerful shift. External experiences begin to reflect internal order more consistently, not as magic, but as correspondence. Ancient thinkers described this as alignment with the divine mind, not as religious doctrine, but as experiential observation that coherent consciousness produces coherent lived experience. This is why initiatory traditions focused so heavily on inner discipline before any form of external influence or mastery. They understood that influence without internal order becomes instability multiplied outward, but internal mastery becomes quiet authority, not dominance, but coherence that naturally organizes experience. The action embedded in this principle is simple but foundational. Stabilize inner order first. Before attempting to control outcomes, direct attention toward internal coherence, thought, emotion, attention, identity. Because once the internal system becomes stable, external complexity becomes easier to navigate without fragmentation. And what once felt like chaos begins to appear as structure not yet understood. Chapter 18. The Forbidden Conclusion. There is a reason ancient teachings were often fragmented, hidden, or wrapped in symbolic language, not always because they were dangerous, but because they were easily misunderstood. The most consistent thread running through Hermetic, Stoic, and mystical traditions is an unsettling idea. Humanity does not simply live inside reality, it participates in its continuous formation through consciousness itself. In modern language, this means experience is not entirely separate from the perceiver. In ancient language, it was expressed as correspondence between inner state and outer world, often summarized in symbolic phrases found in texts like the Emerald Tablet, but over time this understanding became diluted into abstraction, and something essential was forgotten. The sense of responsibility over inner life was replaced with passive observation of external life. Yet the ancient view was far more demanding. It suggested that thoughts, emotions, attention, and identity are not incidental. They are active components in shaping lived reality, not in a simplistic cause and effect way, but in continuous feedback between consciousness and experience. A final parable from a mystical tradition tells of a sealed chamber deep within an ancient temple. Inside there were no treasures, no artifacts, no inscriptions, only a polished surface that reflected whoever entered. Many seekers expected revelation. They searched the room, tried rituals, whispered questions. Nothing happened, only reflection. Eventually, one seeker stopped trying to change the chamber and simply observed himself in it. Over time, he noticed something subtle. The longer he observed without reaction, the more clearly he saw his own internal patterns, thoughts, emotional reflexes, habitual judgments. When he left, he told the keeper, "There was nothing in the room." The keeper replied, "Then you did not stay long enough." The real teaching was not in the chamber. It was in what the chamber revealed. This is the essence of the final realization. Reality is continuously responding to consciousness, but most of that response is filtered through unconscious patterns that go unobserved. Which is why transformation rarely comes from effort alone, it comes from awareness. And sustained awareness changes the system that interprets life itself. This leads to the final experiment, one that ancient initiates often treated as a threshold practice, a 30-day awareness observation. For one cycle of time, the instruction is simple: observe thoughts without immediate identification. Observe emotional reactions without automatic expression. Observe behavioral impulses without unconscious enactment. Observe attention, what it clings to, what it avoids, what it repeats. Not to control anything at first, but to see clearly, because what is not seen continues to operate unseen. And what is seen begins to lose automatic control. Over time, patterns that once felt like identity begin to appear as processes, and processes can be transformed. This is the quiet threshold where ancient wisdom becomes lived reality, not when knowledge increases, but when observation deepens enough to interrupt unconscious repetition. And in that interruption, something fundamental becomes visible. You are not merely inside your life, you are participating in its unfolding moment by moment, which leads to the final line, preserved in various forms across mystical traditions and echoed in modern psychological insight. What rules your mind quietly rules your reality, not as metaphor, but as lived structure. And once this is seen clearly, there is no return to unconscious living in the same way again.